Watch The Atheist Experience live Sundays at 4:30 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTAXP and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callaxp.
It's time to get sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show that is brought to you by the word iatrogenic. I'm Christy Powell. My co-host tonight is brought to you by the letters O and fuck. Welcome, Laura Magee. And tonight we are joined again by associate marriage and family therapist Emily Maynard. Welcome back, Emily.
Hi, everybody. So glad to be here.
Yeah, super excited to have you. We are going to be talking about all kinds of pseudoscience and junk therapy and trying to sort out the difference. And we'd love to hear from you. So give us a call tonight. We're going to be at 512-991-9242, or you can reach us at tiny.cc/callsex. Give us a call because the show is coming right now. All right. Well, that music means that we are going to start this week the way we do every week with what's turning us on this week. Emily, super excited to have you back tonight. What's got you turned on right now?
Hey, well, what's turning me on is some good old-fashioned stretching. So finding a place or a body position that just feels a little bit, a little bit painful. If that sounds good. A little bit, tough or rough in there. And then working it out till you can find some release. I think stretching is sexy.
Yeah, I mean, no lie. Like it grounds you to your body. It gives you a sense of the push and pull. I'll thank you of what's going on. I hear it. Laura, what's got you turned on?
So I have two things tonight that are turning me on. The first is date night, because that is a really good way, no matter how you practice it. Or how you define it. It is a really good way to just have some fun and stay connected with your partner or partners or whatever that may look like. And the second one is just good old-fashioned communication. Like I've had a lot of conversations with friends lately where when they're kind of giving me their ails or like, hey, this is bothering me or this is what's going on, it comes down to them not having good communication with their partner. And it's like, hey, y'all just need to talk and be more honest with each other or have someone help you. Like go find a therapist or a counselor that can help you through these conversations. So yeah, just good old open communication.
So sweet from both of y'all. I'm going to have to make sure to come up with something really nasty next week, but I actually love these recommendations, especially like fresh year, fresh start. I think this is all great tips. But let's jump into the conversation a little bit. And I guess I just want to start by saying that part of the inspiration for this episode was a conversation I had with Dr. Daryl Ray about Enneagrams. In short, I've always kind of dismissed Enneagrams as sort of like pseudoscience, but there was a counselor that I really respected that kind of invited me to take another look. And she sort of explained it this way. She said that your Enneagram is not like your personality type. It's more your target. You know, it's aspirational. It's something that like matches your abilities and skills, but that you're actively working to strive towards. I've been trying to wrap my head around that all week, but Emily, I guess I wanted to kind of check in and see if that resonated for you at all.
I think Enneagrams are an interesting concept, but I think one thing that kind of puts them in the pseudoscience category for me is they don't work in all cultural or personal contexts. And I don't know, I kind of see them like astrology, like, oh, that's interesting. If you really are into it, that's fine. It's not real, but if you love reading about patterns or, pieces of identity and feel like it resonates for you, that's fine with me.
Yeah, I think I feel that way about a lot of personality testing, at least once we get into the counseling office. Like it's
Yeah.
one
Mhm.
thing when you are in like HR and you're trying to match people to different positions, or if you're doing different types of like psychological research. I should say here that there are a lot of personality tests that are much more valid and much more reliable than Enneagrams actually are. But ultimately, how do you feel about just personality types in therapy, but particularly just knowing that so much of our audience is coming from a church culture that is really eager to label people as the nurturer, the protector, the blue or the gold or the seven with a wing of whatever the fuck. I don't know. I know I'm a Miranda and a Ravenclaw, and that's about as far as I can take it. What about you?
I just think it goes back to like this is kind of made up, and if everything is made up, then it can be interesting.
Sure.
But yeah, I guess there's certain pieces of I don't know a formal identity track that are entertaining, but not really scientific. I think especially in a therapy context, if it's helpful for your self understanding and self exploration, great. But even in, I think, the HR world, so many of these tests, once they're validated outside of the context that they're made in, they're found to be unreliable and sort of self validating. But I don't know, is somebody who's, like have a lot of woo a better coworker? I don't know. I appreciate a coworker who shows up and does their job more than I appreciate somebody who has a label on their wall.
Yeah, not to mention just the Barnum statements that go along with it, and sort of the over identification. Like, well, somebody told me one time that I was this personality type, and therefore this is how I must operate. And yeah, I don't know that it really leads to useful like growth and change.
Well, so that leads into a question that I had about this that I was hoping that both of you two could answer. Is the self-fulfilling prophecy aspect of personality tests. So there's the one side of validating, like, oh, I've always known that I was this or that, right? But then there's also, oh, because I got this in a personality test, now I'm gonna start sort of emulating those behaviors or focusing more on those behaviors. What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Eh, yeah, I feel like it's problematic. Like I appreciate the aspirational aspect to it. Like I like the notion of being able to say this matches my skill set, and so maybe I can lean into sort of the more noble aspects of this particular factorial analysisly grouped, idea, and maybe be aware of some of the pitfalls that like commonly go along with it. But I think I'm with you, Emily. Like, I just don't consistently see any useful outcome data suggesting that these strategies lead to anything good.
Yeah, and I think we should always be suspicious of anything that would increase productivity in the service of capitalism.
Yeah.
So anything that's like put
Get
in a
that on a
corporate
t-shirt.
context
Yeah.
to like work better, I'm like, no thanks, I'm good. We don't need any of this.
So, Emily had mentioned cultural context earlier, and Ironclad Alibi had put in text just before the show started. What is pseudoscientific therapy? Is it things like acupuncture, and Reiki? So, I wanted to jump in with that question right off the bat because I think it's kind of relevant to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I guess I'll say that, I don't know that those modalities in particular are showing up often in the counseling office, but there is a lot of I mean, I know so many therapists that have a master's degree in science and a deck of tarot cards right next to each other on the shelf. And I think that's kind of what we wanted to get into tonight, is like what some of those like bullshit philosophies or less well researched modalities that do kind of seep in to the therapeutic relationship.
Yeah, the thing that stands out for me is pulling those things which have validity in their cultural context outside of that context. So if we think about the course of human history, right, even thinking about psychology, it's actually a pretty new invention, right? The
Sure.
science of behavior and the mind is, happened really in the last like 200 to 300 years. Whereas cultures have been practicing, healing rituals or community practices long before that. So I worry about white supremacy, right, or colonialism pulling things like Reiki or acupuncture outside of cultural contexts, and again, using them in the service of whiteness or capitalism, or kind of taking just the top piece of something like that and then
Mhm.
calling it therapy, or calling it, charging $300 an hour to a group in LA for something that I think, doesn't really have any validity in our culture, let alone in, a sort of more formal scientific method.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you tagged that in on the end where you said formal scientific method, because my follow-up question was going to be, isn't there an argument to be had that some of these things aren't even useful even within their cultural context? So we may want to walk on eggshells and be very careful about how we approach other people's cultures and how they do things, but is there not still an argument to be had that, well, regardless of what culture you're in, scientifically this has no bearing, or scientifically this doesn't improve one's health or one's well-being? So I'm glad you threw that out there, so we almost don't even need to touch it, but I did wanna sort of glaze over it a little
Just
bit just
highlight that.
to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So
I
getting
think
back to some of the. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say one thing that is confirmed in scientific research is the power of suggestion, and the placebo effect have been
Mhm.
confirmed over and over again. So I think that's something to note, is like, if in your cultural context it has meaning, it may improve your life because of your cultural context. So I've always want to play around a little bit with like the fact that validity of what other people think and what you think actually has an impact on reality.
Yeah, I think that's a really significant thing here. And, we may not want to chase this rabbit too far, but it really is worth saying that we often are very dismissive about the placebo effect. Oh, it's just placebo, as that's sort of shorthand for saying it's not real. When you work in mental health, when you work in the social sciences, you recognize that placebos are incredibly powerful, that the power of the mind and the ways in which we focus it, the things that we believe, those are really significant. If we can't identify and isolate a specific method of action, we tend to dismiss it as pseudoscience, and that's with good reason. But it is not to suggest that there isn't the potential for like meaningful power in some of these things, but the ability to like isolate, identify, bottle, and replicate that power is often really overblown. And so I think that's something to kind of keep in our back pocket here. But I really wanted to focus tonight on sort of what we're seeing in like modern American therapist office, because right now I know that people who have never been in therapy are kind of rushing towards it. Every talented therapist that I know right now is feeling pretty overwhelmed by the number of inquiries and folks that are reaching out. Uh, you know, a global crisis will kind of do that to you. A couple of years of like terrible government management and the crumbling of society. Okay, I'm gonna have an existential crisis if we don't move on. But yeah, there's a lot of significant things to talk about here.
Well, that's perfect. So that being said, Emily, what are some of the red flags in therapy, like for in looking for a therapist?
Yeah, for me, I would say, depending on where you are, right, in your country or in your state, there might be more of an emphasis just in your culture on using religion as a therapeutic tool.
Mm.
So screening out somebody who's going to offer to send you, I don't know, forward you Joel Osteen's newsletter every week as a therapeutic intervention, which has been suggested, right,
Whew,
to
that's the
some of the groups
biggest,
that I know
reddest of
about.
flag.
Right? Like, run as fast as you can. But just noticing, most therapists have either a profile or a website, some way that even if you're going through your medical office referrals, to validate what sort of things are people talking about in their work. Are they using sort of, I don't know, bullshitty language or kind of religious tones? Especially if you come from a background of religion, you'll probably be very wary of what sort of like magical phrases feel like religious triggers to you.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some great organizations that work specifically with people who, have agreed to not use religion at all in therapy. But that's a big red flag for me.
Sure.
Yeah. So then what about some other things that maybe aren't tied specifically to religion or culture? Things like music therapy or sand tray work. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah,
those are.
Yeah, Emily, let me leave that to you.
Yeah, I can start. Certainly things like music therapy or sand tray work have been validated and studied and are legitimate forms of therapy for specific concerns. But I don't know if, a general practitioner would know about those specifically. Christy, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the certification is kind of significant, but I think that both of those are super valid. At least as far as I know, there is really good research. I did pull out a handful of studies that are in the show notes for this episode, so you can kind of verify a few of the things that we're talking about. But I know that right now there's a lot of kind of experimentation in therapy. The pandemic has pushed a lot of people online, which has, I think, just sort of served to validate a lot of what the research we already had said, which is that online counseling has at least the potential to be every bit as good as in-person counseling. I can say just from my own tiny microscopic sample size that in my experience, it can for some people be actually beneficial, perhaps more effective than in person. For most people, I think generally in person tends to be more powerful, but you can still get great effects doing online counseling. With all that in mind, though, I know a lot of therapists are kind of using this as an opportunity to do things like walking therapy or hiking therapy or some of these like get out of the office practices. Emily, do you feel like we should be kind of wary of things like that?
If somebody's following an apparent standard of ethics in their area, right, they're doing it licensed, they include information about risk to confidentiality in their consent documents. I think there's a lot of legal concerns with some of those practices. But if somebody appears to be doing it ethically, and that's the kind of therapy that you feel like would work for you, right, if you're more interested in nature therapy or really grounding with, an experience of movement, then what we know again from multiple studies is the relationship with your therapist and your perception of the effectiveness of the therapy actually has significant impact on you as the client getting the results that you want.
Mm-hmm.
That is really fascinating, and that leads me into another, like, talking about going outside and doing nature therapy. Here's a little left turn for you guys as well. We on Secular Sexuality have been trying for a year now to talk to a therapist who offers Dungeons and Dragons process groups and appearing on the show. And we haven't gotten them on yet, but what do you think about that sort of out of the box modality?
Again, I'm for out of the box as long as it's ethical, it's useful to you, right? The client is ultimately the judge of whether or not something is working for them. And if it appears to be, useful in the context of the therapeutic theory, right? Maybe that person's theory is the power of stories to influence reality, right? So the stories we tell ourselves or the ways we interact with each other in like a D&D game or an Among Us game or something like that actually has the power to help us, role play different ideas, practice things that are more difficult if we were to think about going to a group face to face as ourselves, right? Like as people interested in talking about sex and having sex be a normal, healthy part of society and life, like we know the power of role play. We know the power of being able to try on different identities or try new things and fail and, find enjoyment or pleasure in ways that, I don't know, maybe are harder to find out in like or the other places, like, going to the mall is like one way of finding enjoyment in life, and doing a therapy D&D group is another.
Yeah, I'm super fascinated. I would love to learn more about that kind of strategy because it definitely feels foreign to me as a therapist, but I can't dismiss it. I think that there could be a lot of value to it. But Emily, I wanted to return to something that you said earlier about some of that like kind of mystical language and some of those maybe like trigger terms or things that might be indicators because we spoke a few weeks ago on the show about mindful self-compassion and increasingly I see an emphasis on a lot of therapy modalities that at least originated in like Buddhist meditation or in shamanic
Mm.
healing. And some of these actually have like an incredible body of research. What should we make of those kinds of practices?
Yeah, again, I kind of go back to like, are they useful? Are they harmful? Are they practiced in a context that feels like it's what you want, right? Like the beauty of therapy is that there's so many things. If you're like, I want to work on this behavior pattern, and I like doing that through charts and tracking information and, really focusing on, right, like tracking my thoughts and feelings and how that impacts my behavior and well-being, go see a cognitive behavioral therapist. Like you're going to love it. And if you're like, I don't want to do any of that. I want to sit and talk about the past and my family and, like, great. There's going to be people who are really skilled at doing that. So thinking about meditation, right? Like one, is it a practice that's useful to you? Try it. There is really great scientific research about the calming effects that it has, right? The way that it can increase well-being or connection to others, like things that we really care about, taking care of our communities and taking care of ourselves. But again, if you feel red flaggy, like you might be in the presence of some bad therapy and it's okay to leave.
Hmm. Yeah, I should mention to folks that we did an episode with Dr. Daryl Ray and with another therapist, Andy Lane, back in the fall about how to find not just a good therapist, but specifically finding like the right therapist for you. And no matter where you're watching this, if you feel like you are, pretty far away from a metropolitan area and you're worried about how do I find a like reliable secular therapist in my area, there is a great collection of resources. We're going to go over some more at the end, but I want to specifically mention that episode, which has already been linked in the show notes to this episode, where you can find a lot of good information about how to track down the right therapist and how to know that they're specifically the right therapist for you.
Christy, I'm really glad you mentioned that because there's been some conversation in chat about people having a hard time finding therapists that specifically that aren't religious and that don't have
Mhm.
a very religious agenda with how they do their treatment. And so I just wanted to second that. And as these people in chat are chit chatting, to let you guys know that yeah, there are options out there. They're significantly harder to find depending on where you live. So don't give up and keep trying. But also, I wanted to take that as an opportunity to just throw out there. We have open phone lines, and this conversation is going really good. And I'm sure that we could take it all the way through the episode. But some of this stuff in chat is really good to just kind of tackle a little bit more nuanced conversation about it. So if you guys feel the bravery to get on the phone lines, trust me, it's way easier than you think it will be. Give us a call now and chit chat with us. It's an easy conversation, but it will really help to keep that like what you guys are talking about in chat to be able to really tackle it live on the show. So yeah, don't be afraid. Give us a call. And now, Christy,
Mhm.
I wanted to throw this out there to both you and Emily. We talked a little bit offline about play therapy. Now that's getting more involved with children. And you had said that you're not really familiar with it, but I wanted to just ask you guys because we're talking a lot about adult therapy, secular therapy. But a lot of us have kids out there, and I know my son when he was younger and was going through some issues found a lot of success with play therapy and also had some issues with it. So, without me getting too much into our personal story, I wanted to kind of find out from you guys what your thoughts are.
Yeah, Emily, I think you may have a little bit more of a background in this than I do, but I'll just say that play therapy modalities are tricky, are messy. Working with the mind is complicated enough. Working with the mind of somebody who has the verbal skills of a 5-year-old going to be especially tricky. Like talk therapy is very challenging for somebody who can't pronounce their S's. So, when you're working with kids, it can be difficult for sure. And there's a lot of efficacy in a lot of different play therapy styles. I couldn't say a whole lot more about the specifics other than it's very much like a valid and important part of the field. Emily, is there anything you can add on to that?
Yeah, I'm thinking about human development. We know that play or creative expression is such an important part of development of the human brain and the mind, right? Like that's why it's so important that kids and families, anybody who's raising children, have the resources to live safe, stable lives, right? So that kids can have a chance to play. So I think what's great about play therapy is that's a type of therapy that has really channeled the importance of something that we know is vital to human brain development and really works to use that method to help heal and encourage and support children who are having a difficult time. There's even some therapists I know who've used it right with adults who really want to connect with maybe something that they feel was underdeveloped in their childhood or just want to throw in something different that day, right? There's a lot of power of human connection, of movement. So something as simple as like passing a ball back and forth, if that's you and your therapist, or I'll say you can also do this if you're having difficult conversations with your partner or partners or another family member, right? Something as simple as like throwing a ball back and forth actually connects our brains and helps us communicate better and stay attuned to more difficult conversations. So that's a little like play therapy technique that I think is actually really useful in a lot of other contexts.
I like that. I think that's really good information. So we talk a lot about therapists that have maybe one or two approaches, and are those approaches good or bad? And overall, you've said, hey, as long as it's working and as long as it's ethical. So I want to know how you feel about counselors that double up their efforts. So counselors that double as mindfulness coaches or bring in things like meditation and yoga into the therapy office. And I'm even going to reverse that and say double as yoga coaches and bring therapy into the yoga classroom. What are your thoughts on that kind of stuff?
I'll go ahead and acknowledge that I, as a therapist, actually partner with a yoga therapist. I have a childhood friend who is a certified yoga teacher trainer, I believe is the technical term. And she's actually was on this show like a million years ago and is incredible asset to my clients. I'm not myself trained in any sort of yoga. I'm actually quite awkward at it, but I find some value in it, and increasingly there is a lot of good data that shows us that we can use these I'm forgetting the particular acronym or what it means, but these types of like additional therapies, these sort of adjuncts that we can throw in. I think that there is a lot of value there. Like Emily's been saying, it kind of comes down to what resonates and what clicks. But, in particular, when we bring in meditation or some of these other modalities to the therapy office, oftentimes the reason why they are uncomfortable is because they're working. Now, I don't want you to ignore what's going on in your body. I don't want anybody hearing this to say that like, oh, well, everything inside of me feels like it's screaming, but, Christy Powell said that I should go forward. I'm not saying that at all. Listen to your body. If you are feeling anxious, if you're noticing some red flags, if something just isn't fitting for you, then let your therapist know that that's not working for you. But I do want to say that there's plenty of valid research showing that specifically things like mindfulness coaching, things like meditation coaching and yoga therapies and these different kinds of things can be really useful when paired with therapy. And if it makes you feel a little uncomfortable and you feel like you can, not like you're doing some huge straining power lift, But if you feel like you're doing just a little bit of a stretch and maybe it's a little bit challenging, but it kind of feels like a good burn, that might be something to really lean into.
I think the kind of things that you're talking about, Laura and Christy, are both really powerful, especially in terms of trauma healing, right? Like we are mammals, like coming back to this fact that like we're animals and body movement has an impact on our brain and our well-being in whatever capacity your body can move, whatever abilities you have, movement is useful to us, right? Like, so I'm interested in some of the sort of more woo-woo, I would say, end of therapy, right? So I'm trained in a method called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, that feels a little bit weird, especially if you're just hearing about it for the first time. Doing it for the first time can feel really weird. But
Seconded.
again and again, yeah, I've done it, and it's really strange. But it seems to tap into something that we can make our brain work through some natural processes with a little bit of prompting in a way that reduces trauma triggers, right? So something as simple as like, this feels really weird, but knowing that there's all these research studies to back up the validity of using EMDR to reduce the physical impacts of trauma, or using trauma-informed yoga, right, to reduce the sensations of panic or anxiety or dissociation that are associated with trauma. Yeah, if you're interested in doing that kind of work and you find somebody who, again, is like a legal and ethical practitioner of that, it might feel a little uncomfortable, but if you're getting the results that you hope for, keep going.
Well, Emily, I guess this is the last question before we jump onto the phones, but you and I talked a little bit before the show about how we're both looking into certifications, and we both work and operate in the sort of sex therapy realm, a world in which way too many therapists have not done their homework, or actually like gotten sort of the basic rudimentary trainings that they should need. And I guess I wanted to ask, in that realm, where do you draw the lines? Like, what feels appropriate when you're recommending to a client, like, hey, explore your sexuality, work through your shame, like inhabit your body, some of these kinds of things, without, going into like crossing boundaries or becoming a little bit too close on or too intimate on some of these topics. I don't know even a specific question here, but I'd love to just hear you speak a little bit about sort of how you draw those lines, or maybe more importantly for the audience, like how you know that those lines are being crossed in ways that maybe aren't ethical or that are concerning.
Yeah, right. I think knowing how you feel is really important. So it's really on the therapist, right, as the practitioner, the person with the legal and ethical responsibility to you and your well-being as a client or person that they're working with. Sex therapy should feel maybe a little uncomfortable, but it's not going to feel creepy. If it feels creepy, you have every right to speak up for yourself, say this feels like too much right now, or I don't really understand the point of this, or I'm not interested in having this conversation with you. But if you have somebody who's trained and certified in sex therapy, or who's advertising that, right, saying like, I can help you with this, you should expect them to be very comfortable talking about sex in medical, emotional, relational aspects. That's on them, right? To be the expert, and for you to rely on them to provide resources that fit your needs.
Yeah, and I think I can echo that and just sort of draw the line at if you feel uncomfortable, tell your therapist. And they'll respond. And perhaps, again, we should be willing to push against that discomfort gently. But if you tell them that something makes you uncomfortable, their response is going to be like the most meaningful and significant data point that you have to operate from. Because if they hear that you're uncomfortable and they keep pushing forward anyway, that's just not good therapy, regardless of the topic or the appropriate boundaries.
But if there's something you're interested in, like ask your therapist if they can research it for you, or develop resources, or find someone else in their field who can, right? Like therapists get to ask each other, right? Like, hey, I'm working with somebody who's looking for a resource in XYZ, right? What books or articles are useful if you're thinking about like polyamory, right? Like, well, great. There's therapists who work specifically with that and who have resources available. So if there's something that even if your therapist doesn't specialize in it, ask them to do a little bit of the work for you and help you out if there's something you want to know more about.
Yeah, the amount of time that I spend specifically in therapist, like online support groups, Facebook groups, and things like that, just giving people book recommendations on polyamory specifically. I mean, if I was billing, I'd have a much better house. But in any case, I feel like this would be a good moment to jump on the phones. Laura, do you have anybody pull up for us?
Yeah, absolutely. We have Stephanie. Pronouns are she, her. She's in Maine. And I love how her topic plays into what we've been talking about because she wants to talk about the misguided, debunked science of conversion therapy.
Oh, yeah.
Which I was hoping that it's one of those really ugly topics, but I was hoping that we'd touch on it in terms of pseudoscience. So, Stephanie, yeah, thank you for calling.
Oh, you're quite welcome. And thank you for discussing this topic. It's really quite fascinating. But I wanted to get your take on therapists who have been in practice for years and years and years, who pretty much have had their theories debunked. Thinking specifically around the notions of conversion therapy for gay people, for trans people. A man who was part of the rewriting of the DSM, Ray Blanchard, came up with a theory about trans people called autogynephilia, which has been widely debunked. Yet, one of his acolytes and colleagues at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, Kenneth Zucker, practiced there for years, like 30 years, before he was finally dismissed in 2018. And of course, Canada has banned conversion therapy quite recently through legal action. And I wonder if you might want to talk about how science changes and how the legacy of medical respectability can cling to folks like Ken Zucker and Ray Blanchard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, let me, I guess, just first come out and say, like, very clearly, in case there's any confusion, since we're raising the issue, that there is absolutely no validity to the notion of conversion therapy. Even if we could change somebody's sexual orientation or their gender through that type of therapy, I don't know why we should or why we would want to, but the simple reality is that we cannot. We cannot. That's been proven over and over and over again. And you'll see that from the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, on and on and on and on. So I just want to make sure that if somebody's been living under a rock and has not caught that information, that we're very thoroughly announcing that. But beyond that, I hear the challenge around like older therapists not necessarily staying current with the times, and that's a really tricky wicket. Like, the truth is, in this field there is not a lot of oversight once you are licensed, which, you know, certainly took a lot of time and energy and effort to do well, but is not particularly prohibitive. Like, I know tons of really bad therapists, I guess is what I'm trying very politely to find a way to say. I graduated with a bunch of very bad therapists, and such people exist. But I feel like I'm rambling, and so I'll maybe let Emily jump in here quickly. But I guess I just want to say that, yes, there are plenty and plenty of very experienced and very talented older therapists, and they are an incredible asset to our community. And yes, most of these theories and modalities that worked well 30 years ago do work well today. And yes, the new modalities that we're coming up with kind of seemingly every day, there's some sort of new fad, are not really particularly more magically effective than some of the things that we've been using for 30 years. All of those things are pretty much true, while at the same time, I think most folks would be shocked to recognize that people at the beginning of their career tend, according to research, to be much more effective therapists. People are often very uncomfortable seeing a associate therapist or an intern therapist or somebody who has been practicing for less than 5 years. And, with good reason, I suppose, as people are still getting their feet under them. But I do want to tell you that the research suggests that those people are oftentimes going to be much more effective, particularly if they are somebody that you can connect with. Like Emily's been saying, most of therapy just comes down to the therapeutic relationship and how comfortable you feel in that relationship and in the conversation with them. So let me back off and Emily, let you jump in here, please.
Yeah, Stephanie, I think you bring up such a great point, right? When we're talking about being scientifically minded people, we have that understanding that science is always checking itself and reframing its ideas, right? And progressing in a way. We're interested in things getting better and being more effective. And often that means leaving behind things that we discover are actually harmful, right? Like you think we're on the DSM-5, right? So there's been 4 other versions that have things in them that we say that no longer exists, or that's no longer a problem, or we're no longer going to use that language. So even when we're talking about, scientific progress and progress in mental health treatment, understanding, we're also talking about things that are impacted by humans, by things like religious abuse and religious ideas about sexuality, that are impacted by racist ideas about people and sexuality and human practices. So I think really it's up to the field to continue the scientific progress and to reject publicly practices that are determined to be harmful to people, right? And to very vocally work against people who maintain positions of power while espousing, treatment systems or ideas that are destructive to the people they're claiming to help.
Mm-hmm.
If I may, I'll just say that I may be stuck in the '90s a little bit, because that's when I really had some continuous interaction with the therapist community, and as you may know, that's kind of when Dr. Blanchard's ideas were prevalent in around the phenomenon, or if you call it that, of transgender folk, and I was quite lucky. I found a really good therapist who thought, who had enough real life experience with trans people to realize that these notions were absolute bunkum. And I was lucky in that regard. I was also, I found more value in friends of mine who were sort of in the woo community, that they were shamans. And they gave me far more help than the accredited doctor who contributed to the DSM to the DSM throughout his career and continues to do so. So it's just, I think there's a little bit of a back and forth with, as you say, what works for you is probably the most important thing.
There's certainly an aspect to that, Stephanie. And it is a lot about, like, does this feel right? Does this resonate with me? Is this a exercise or a strategy or a thought process that feels real and that I can get behind. But I guess I also just want to highlight the fact that, forgive me, my words are kind of escaping me here, but the really significant aspect to all of this is whether or not the therapist is trying to push their particular agenda for you. You know, if a therapist's only goal is to help you to reach your goals, you're going to likely reach your goals. But if the therapist comes in and says, well, but you're drinking too much, or well, you're working too much, or well, you're confused about your gender, you're confused about your sexuality, and they're trying to tell you about you and then trying to reshape you into some like platonic ideal that exists exclusively in their mind, that's never going to be good therapy, regardless of the strategies that they're applying. So I hope that can provide a little bit of a through line, just the notion that we are always looking for therapists that support us in meeting our goals, not a therapist who's going to try and force us towards or push us in the direction of some sort of like imaginary universal right way to be.
Yeah, I think it's a back and forth. Therapy is a conversation, really. It's where, who is this person? I mean, I think the best therapists are the people that are the most curious about who they are talking to, and don't necessarily have preconceived notions as to. Well, certainly in some cases, especially in the case of conversion therapy, that you're wrong. If you go into a therapy environment and the therapist is basically saying you are wrong from the get, they're not curious as to who you are in the first place. You know,
and so even from the other side of that,
I feel like it's a back and forth for people.
Yeah, and I'll just acknowledge that from the other side of things, when people come into me or come into my office and they say, this thing about me is broken and I want to fix it, or I have like this addiction, or I have this whatever, and I need you to help me change it. If it is something that I don't believe can be changed through therapy, if it's a change that they are wanting to make, even if I trust the client to be the expert on themselves, and even if I feel that it is my job to be here to support the client, if their goal is not something that I can get behind because they are trying to not like affirm their gender, but like rip it out in some way. If they are trying to not maybe channel their sexuality, but are wanting to like break it in some way, I'll be very upfront with them that I don't know that I can help them do that. And perhaps we can't do good work together. And if your therapist is not having those types of conversations with you, then I don't know if the relationship will work. But I do really appreciate you raising the issue of conversion therapy with this. I think that's something we definitely needed to get into tonight, Stephanie.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the call, and you sound like the kind of therapist I could work with.
Well, glad to hear it.
Stephanie, thank you so much for calling. That was a great conversation.
Bye.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah, well, great conversation. A lot of fun to be had going forward. But for now, let's take a quick moment and see what's been going on around the rest of the ACA. And of course, we are joined by Mandisa Thomas.
Hello, I think this is my first time on Secular Sexuality. Maybe
we get to be
second?
first.
I don't know. I think I'm rational. Probably not. But like some people say that I am, and it's like I still have this weird thing that freaks me out, and I don't know. Everybody's got those.
No, I was just gonna say, honestly, I'm not surprised. I know some people out there may be hearing this and think, wow, I really would have thought Satan would have done better.
We're riding off into the sunset, and I want the chat to tell us which one of us is Butch Cassidy and which one of us is the Sundance Kid.
Who's Thelma and who's Louise?
And joining me today is Dave Carpe, the bleeping DM.
Do we actually bleep on this show? I thought we said everything.
You're goddamn right we do, Dave.
We say everything. All right. So if you guys missed any of those, check them out. I know that they're really, really good episodes, and I always love seeing the little tidbits they pull out of them. They're always really good. So getting back to the episode that we're on right now, though, I can imagine that the takeaway from this episode might be something like do your own research, or that it could be really overwhelming with, is this a good practice or a bad practice? Or how do I even know if it works for me? And people can start to become kind of skeptical about everything that their therapist says. And we've also mentioned, I know Emily a few times has mentioned trust in the therapeutic relationship is like the most important part of counseling. So how do you guys recommend sort of balancing these two things?
Trust is earned, right? Like it's tricky. Like we have to be willing to suspend disbelief a little bit. I mean, I think this is true in any relationship with your kids, with your partner. Like, yes, trust is earned, but we also need to extend a little bit of credit initially and give people something of the benefit of the doubt. Like you go to their website, you go to their Psychology Today page, you see what they're talking about, and it clicks, it resonates for you. And so you're willing to give them a little bit of slack. And then you meet them and you start talking to them, and maybe they push you a little bit and make you uncomfortable a little bit. And I think a little bit is okay, but too much is too much. I guess I'm not really sure quite how to draw that line, though. Emily, is there anything that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, when I'm trying to support people who are looking for a therapist, I always say three things. One is that you should like your therapist, right? You're going to have to talk to this person about stuff that's really challenging in your life, in your relationships, right? With sexuality, with your past, with your job, right? So you should genuinely think, okay, I could probably talk to this person and then try it out and see how it goes, right? You should feel like it's possible to really open up to them about difficult things or something that you need extra support on. Two, you should feel like your therapist likes you, right? Like you should not, right? Sometimes we have these preconceived ideas of like, oh, everyone hates me or I'm a terrible person, right? And therapy is a great place to talk about some of those feelings and where they come from. I think a lot of them come from religion. I don't know. That's just something that is really powerful. But you should genuinely feel like your therapist is helping you and like they're supportive of you as a person who's there trying to improve their life and your life in some way. And then the last thing is you should feel like you like what you're doing, right? Not that you'll like every session, because therapy can be really challenging. It can be exhausting. It can be painful in certain ways, but you should feel like this is in service of your goals and the outcomes that you're hoping for. So the discomfort, like you said earlier, Christy, is like, it's not for the therapist to make you into what the therapist thinks you should be, but the work that you're doing is really to get the results that you want for your life. And if you're not feeling like that's happening at the pace you want it or in the way you want it, or you want to ask your therapist, like, hey, is there validation for this thing that we're doing? Or did you just make it up? A good therapist will be able to handle those questions and say, absolutely, let's talk about why I think this might work for you. And if we need to adjust it, we will. So just remember, like, you should kind of like your therapist or be willing to talk to them. You should feel like, they like you and are useful to you. And then you should like the work that you're doing or feel like it's at least in service of your goals.
I like that notion of kind of breaking it down into 3 steps of things that you enjoy, that you actually like. I might tell people that your therapist is somebody that you should kind of really want to go and get a beer with, but also be able to trust not to go and get a beer with you.
I like that. I don't know, as the token layperson on this show tonight, I just want to really encourage people just really quickly that it's okay to look for another therapist, right? Like I've had some really,
Mm-hmm.
really great therapists in the past, and I'm sandwiched between two of the greatest therapists right now as we're talking. But I've also had therapists that I didn't like so much. Two of them specifically that I did one session with, and that was it. That was all I needed. And I knew it right off the bat. One, and I'm not going to get too into details or anything, but one of which it was only me in the therapy room with her, and she was already diagnosing my husband with OCD. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt really, because I didn't want him to be the bad guy. I wanted to be able to talk through problems without putting him on like a me versus him sort of scenario. And I really didn't like how she approached it. So I just want to encourage people, like right off the bat, if you get any weird, funny feelings, or if you're thinking like maybe they're even two in my court, right? Like that was a little bit much for me.
Yeah,
Go
I've
ahead
I've had
and talk
5
about it.
different therapists over the course of my life, and 2 of them were worth a damn. So, there are not, I mean, there are plenty of not great therapists out there, but more importantly, there are a lot of therapists that won't be great for you. So, yeah,
Yeah.
be willing to like play around and find the right connection.
Yeah, and definitely you'll feel it. Yeah.
Mm.
Emily, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say sometimes therapists offer, right, like a free 15-minute phone call, or they'll encourage you to come to the first session, but it really is something that they need to sort of earn your trust, right? Like especially in the world of online therapy right now, you should be able to find someone who's licensed and able to practice legally in your area, that is doing the kind of work that you're interested in, or is the kind of person you imagine being helpful to you. So most therapists that I know, I certainly, want to have a phone call with someone and make sure that we both agree that this is probably a good fit, and we'll reevaluate that as we go.
I really like that approach. Yeah. So going back to the whole layperson thing, what does good therapy research look like for a layperson? Then you're talking about maybe giving them a phone call or having a conversation with them, but how much digging should a person expect to do in order to find a therapist that works for them?
Yeah, I guess I'll say that like if your therapist recommends like a particular strategy, or if you ask them like, well, what kind of theories are you operating from, or that question you just asked me, like where does it come from? What is that based on? I feel like they should be able to have a good answer for you. And I might encourage folks to be at least a little bit curious to dive deeper into that research. But I hate the notion of folks feeling like they need to fact check their therapist, like they're watching, the presidential debates, right? Like I really do want to stress being comfortable in that relationship and willing to extend a little bit of trust. Now, if they are worth their salt and if they're doing good therapy, they're going to be able to tell you pretty quickly, oh yeah, if you want to learn more about these ideas, you should read this book. And very rarely when your therapist says you should read this book, is it a bad idea for you to actually go out and buy that book? Now, if you get that book and there are all of these like religious symbols on the cover, all right, okay, well now let's go to Wikipedia and see if there's like a lot of critique around this book. Let's go to like Google Scholar and see if there's any validity or any like meta-analysis around some of these ideas. I don't think you need to go too far down that rabbit hole in order to be able to tell pretty quickly whether or not there's something of value here.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think, it's really important to ask your therapist. I mean, most therapists I know have bookshelves that are overflowing, right? We're doing this
Sure.
work because we like talking about how humans can be better, and, why things are hard for us, and, how to have better sex, right? But especially if you're working with someone and they're trying to send you a religious book, then you might not have been upfront about the fact that you're not interested in that. So that might be a great conversation to say, like, oh, actually, hey, I'm looking for a book about sex, but I just want to make sure I'm not going to get a religious book about sex, right? Like that might be an opportunity for you to be a little bit more open with your therapist, or just check and make sure that you're both aligned with the work that you want to do and the kind of things that you want to carry on outside of session. I think what's tricky is like therapy is a scheduled session time, but it should improve or change or impact the rest of your life too. So, depending on your therapist's preference and yours, you may or may not have homework or readings or journaling or activities outside of session. But if you really want to invest in therapeutic growth, plan on it taking some time outside of that session to work on the things that you feel like would, help you reach your goals.
Yes, that.
So in talking about finding good and bad therapy for you, what would you propose when you're trying out a therapist for the first time? What would be a good like smell test or litmus test for that first when you're getting introduced to a new therapy strategy?
It might be counterintuitive, but I'm just going to say trust your gut. We keep returning to that idea of the relationship and whether or not you feel comfortable. That goes both ways too. Like if you are just over the moon and you think that this therapist is just the most incredible person in the world, maybe there's a reason for that, and it might not be a good reason. But I guess I would just be on the lookout for strong emotion and to kind of lean into what feels natural. And you'll notice the crystal healing stuff. You'll notice the tarot stuff, and I'll even go as far as to say that like I'm working with a therapist right now who I don't think necessarily shares my beliefs about the world or my worldview in a handful of ways. But I'm actually really okay with that. Maybe as a therapist myself, and as this semi-professional atheist or whatever the hell, that I feel like confident and grounded in my ability to like sniff out the things that I don't want to be a part of. But I guess I am comfortable extending that slack because the relationship fits really well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard some people say that, finding a therapist is a little bit like dating, right? But sometimes, right, like even if it's just making a new friend, right? What sort of things do you care about from a friend? Are they a good listener? Do they hear you? Do they respect your time? Do they seem knowledgeable, right? Those are kind of things that I think are good foundations for therapy or for the therapeutic relationship.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to jump into phone calls here really quickly because I know we've got a couple of them piling up. But I guess I just wanted to take a quick moment because I recognize that we've gotten this far into the episode without acknowledging perhaps like the most relevant piece of junk science or pseudoscience that shows up for this show, which is just around the myth of sex addiction. I know Stephanie brought up conversion therapy. That's perhaps the most important one. But Emily, I wanted to give you a chance to just kind of quickly acknowledge like what is some of the like modern thinking around the notion of sex addiction, and what does a savvy consumer need to look for when they're wanting to talk to like a sex positive therapist about sexual behaviors or about their sexuality, when it maybe feels a little bit out of control or when it maybe feels like it is in need of some therapy, some guidance.
Right. I think the addiction language is really tricky. And I think it feels like sometimes a little bit on the spectrum of, hey, maybe this is a word or a concept that we need to leave behind because it doesn't really fit with the scientific knowledge that we have now. Right. It's more of a sort of medical insurance coding term. Right? Rather than something that I think really explains people's experience of sexual behaviors that maybe they discover aren't useful to them or are impacting their relationships in negative ways. I think someone trained in sex therapy can be, right, someone who's certified. There's a couple different national organizations or training programs that someone who specializes in sex therapy would likely have gone through. So you can check out their credentials, look at their website or even find some of those organizations and see if they have a list of therapists that specialize in those kind of things. But I would certainly steer away from someone who was trying to pathologize something in my life that was difficult, right? To someone who claimed that there was something inherently broken or I needed a spiritual 12-step practice to overcome. I would just say, there's actually more and more people out there who are willing to really talk about the impacts of sexual behaviors, the good and the challenging, without it being some sort of pathology that then, sits on your shoulders forever.
Yeah, no, that's a super important point. Like sex is not addictive. We've discussed that on this show before. We'll continue to discuss it. But when you hear that type of pathologizing language around healthy human behavior, I would definitely be concerned. But Laura, let's jump on the phones.
Yeah, so we have a caller who actually has a question that revolves around sex. So while we're on the subject, let's stay on it just a little bit longer. And we have Brock, whose pronouns are he, him. So Brock, thank you for calling.
You're welcome.
Yeah, tell us what's on your mind tonight.
Yeah.
I sort of want to talk about therapy through dating and relationship or sex therapy, because I've never attempted to do that, but I've tried with just let's say a regular therapist, but I don't know, it sort of didn't work out, but we were sort of progressing until the pandemic hit. But there's something else I also wanted to sort of mention and bring in. It's sort of like I was involved in sort of like a peer support group for people that are sort of having doubts about their religious beliefs or leaving or trying to live without it. It was sort of a good way to sort of, and this was in person, and it was sort of good to hear from other people that I'm not the only one who's going through this, but at the same time, I was like the only Black person in there. So at the same time, I sort of felt like not included, especially explaining my background, where it's basically there's like, it's forbidden, especially for my parent, that they didn't talk to me about sex.
Mm-hmm.
Hence why I never had any sexual experience whatsoever. And
well,
sort of
Brock, let me jump in a little bit just to get sort of a sense of where you're headed here. I'm really interested to talk about your therapeutic experiences, but I wanted to know if there was maybe a particular question that we might be able to answer, or if you can kind of help me see what it was that you wanted to maybe clarify or share with us tonight.
Like the red flag thing is where I started to experience that a little bit. Does that also involve with groups that are, let's say, not part of the profession, but sort of just to sort of help me navigate through it?
You're asking about like whether peer support groups are the same as like a therapeutic process group? Is that kind of what you were getting at?
Well, I would know that they're somewhat not, but they would refer to you as that, because like I remember that particular group had their own rules for like moderation when people were taking turns talking about their personal issues. I wonder if there could be a potential red flag in terms of when things are taken out of context, or like you not really comfortable explaining this with a bunch of people you don't know well enough, especially when in terms about your sexual experiences or lack thereof.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, let me take a moment here with Emily to try and maybe clarify some of the kind of fact and like general good information for folks to know about peer support and about process groups and some of the like rules and restrictions and things that go along with that. And we'll go ahead and jump into that conversation and then take the next call. But I do want to let you know how much I appreciate you calling in, and hopefully we can offer some good information here.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Brock, for bringing up this topic. I think it is really important to remember, right, that we're talking about something that we know about, Christy, and that we need to do a better job as therapists about just talking about what are the different options that people have for support. Brock was talking about, a peer support group and some of the challenges that come with that. One is that it's a lot of people to talk to. And especially if you're talking about something that might be difficult for you, it's a lot more people, right, to talk about that in front of. And that's, I think, one of the downsides of a group. It sounds like, at least in that group, there was some sort of moderation or form, right, to keep on track and to keep things really balanced. One of the other things that I think can be really powerful about a peer support group is one normalizes people's experiences. When you hear that other people have similar challenges in life or have even different challenges than your own, that can bring about empathy and connection and reduce shame or some of the things that make talking about this kind of stuff really hard. And secondly, there's usually a greatly reduced cost, right? So one of the challenges of therapy is that it's expensive. Insurance coverage is not great for mental health in the US. And, even if you are able to find a therapist who takes your insurance that you like, that you enjoy working with, often the insurance company ends up interfering with your treatment and requiring specific
in a lot of different
things
ways.
In so many different ways. So sometimes support groups aren't, maybe the best option or meeting all of your needs, but they can help you in your goals, often at no cost or, a very low cost kind of option.
Yeah, so just to make it explicit and clarify a little bit, peer support groups are generally going to be led by lay people. Occasionally, you'll have somebody who has some credentialing or some expertise in that particular area take charge, and they can be really valuable. But it is going to be distinct from like a therapeutic processing group or something that's going to be led by a therapist. But in either of these situations, there is the benefit of the peer relationships. And we've been talking all night about the relationship with the therapist. In a group therapy setting, you are not just in a relationship with the person leading that group. You're in a relationship with everybody in the group. And those relationships can be potentially challenging or difficult, but there's a reason why we do group therapy. It can be really beautiful to have other people's stories and other people to connect with, other people to share with. I lead a religious trauma processing group, and the experience of not just having me say, well, this is very common. Lots of people have this challenge. You're not broken. This makes sense. This is okay. Is not nearly as effective as being able to look to the 4 people on your left and the 4 people on your right and recognize that they're all going through something similar. So, different types of group therapy can be incredibly valuable. And I guess part of what Brock was maybe getting after is that oftentimes these groups will have some restrictions on the type of content that we're able to discuss. And I think that that's appropriate. I wouldn't necessarily see that as a red flag to stay out of that group. But if my concerns don't line up with what the group is here to do, I would encourage you not to swim upstream against that. If the rules say like we're not going to discuss sexual trauma, for instance, it might very well be because we're trying to create a safe space for people who are not comfortable or in a place in their own healing journey to be able to talk about those things. And those rules are there for a reason. So find the right group for you. Does that about cover everything, Emily?
Yeah, I think so.
Perfect. Well, Laura, we're getting a little bit long. Let's take one more call if we can.
Yeah, we have Elliott, whose pronouns are he, him, and he wants to discuss the reproducibility, I'm guessing, of some of these topics in social sciences. So, Elliott, yeah, thanks for calling. Why don't you give us a quick rundown of what you want to talk about?
Yeah, thanks so much, y'all. It's been a great episode so far. And I figured since we're talking about pseudoscience, I'd ask about this. I've heard a lot of, smart people, or maybe pseudo smart people. We'll figure that out. But they've said, psychology and sociology, those studies can't be reproduced. We don't have any evidence of that. And I was just kind of wondering, how true is that? How much of the modern practice of psychology and psychiatry is actually based on reproducible science?
I mean, I would say that the good stuff is all based on reproducible science. Now, I recognize that psychology is not calculus, right? Like, it is very much a soft science. It is a science. It is a science. It has been under development through the scientific method in some form or fashion. I mean, you can draw the line wherever you choose to, but I think 1900, like 1899, Joseph Breuer and Freud starting to publish case studies, like I might draw the line there. And I will say that in all of the history since, we have increasingly gotten better at being able to identify specific psychological constructs, developing valid and reliable measures of those constructs, and then just sort of like flicking things, intervening, like fucking around with complex systems, and then seeing if our measures of those constructs go up or down. We like the therapeutic modality that I kind of lean into and rely on the most. I saw recently that there have been 17,000 different research studies published in around that therapeutic modality in the last 10 years. And each one of those studies, give or take, is effectively like measuring and verifying and validating its results against the other 17,000. So to suggest that nothing in the social sciences could be like measured or validated or replicated is very much out of step. Is it a soft science? Sure. People are soft. People are messy. Anytime you try and measure a person, you're going to have a real challenge on your hands. But that doesn't mean we're just making it up as we go. Does all of that feel true to you too?
Yeah, I'm curious what Elliott's response is to that.
No, I think I'm going to try to be a good skeptic, and I'm going to go do my own research, as best I can. But I think what you were pointing out is exactly some of the stuff that I've already kind of looked at, where it seems those people that are saying, this is more in the line of us just making it up as we go along, those people are just a little bit behind the studies, it seems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I should say that, I mean, we have been publishing like wide scale research for a long time. Early on, Freud and Jung and some of these earlier folks were very reliant on case studies. And for a long time, most, if not all, psychological research was like self-research and, less effective in a lot of ways. But once you get into the 50s and you start talking about B.F. Skinner and Watson, and I could go on and on, we start to work through that data problem. And it's taken a long time, but by the time you get to the 80s and 90s and you start seeing things like cognitive behavioral therapy show up and some of these other things, like we have endless amounts of data on those topics. Now, none of these therapies are perfect. People are squishy. People are difficult to measure. All of that is still super true. I recognize that there is a softness to my science that you wouldn't see in many, many other fields. But, we're figuring it out. We're getting there and we're getting results, because ultimately that's the thing that matters. Like, okay, we've decided that this is a construct and we've decided we can measure this construct and we've decided blah, blah, fucking blah. None of that actually matters if people's lives aren't getting better. And we can say qualitatively, overwhelmingly, that there are therapeutic practices that make lives better. And that can be documented by talking to any of the people in your life who have gone through therapy, but also through looking at like peer-reviewed, widely published research.
I think what's tricky with that is
Thank-
we can get data sets that are large, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that particular modality will work for you, even if you have a similar problem.
Sure.
The same way that if you have, you know, I don't know, an issue with your cholesterol, right? Your doctor is going to take measurements, might prescribe a medication, and then there's going to be follow-ups, and your doctor is going to say, do you have weird side effects? Is this actually working? And take more measurements to make sure that drug that is, you know, approved for a specific purpose actually does work for you, and that they've accurately diagnosed, you know, the problem, a support, and will follow up with you. So I love this question. I think we need more research in psychotherapy. We should constantly be improving as a field. And yet I think there's also enough at this point to say, like, hey, try therapy.
Well, I wanted to
That's
just throw
awesome.
out there. Oh no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I really, really appreciate all three of you, and thanks so much for answering.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you for calling. This is a really good question. And I know that I am by far not the resident expert on any of these things, but I do want to say, like, when it comes to research and it comes to whether or not we can verify these things, a lot of what we talk about in terms of psychology and the human experience, it's just anecdotal, right? And so that can seem like something that's easy to dismiss. But that's why, like Christy was saying, once you start gathering enough anecdotal evidence, we can start to see trends, and we can start to see, like, well, does this work for most people, or does this work? That's why Christy earlier was saying there is no evidence that conversion therapy works, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if anything, it's more damaging. It causes more damage. Well, we
Sure.
have enough anecdotal evidence, and we have enough before, after, you know, and people's experiences to be able to say things like, overall, this is more helpful, or overall, this is less helpful. And so it's not a solid measurement like pounds or ounces or inches or miles, you know. And I know we like those cold hard numbers in terms of data, but there's a lot to be said about people's experiences and what they can say over the course of thousands of people, or the course of decades, you know, whether or not something works.
Yeah, absolutely. So I hope that puts some of the rumors to rest, Elliott. Again, I'm going to acknowledge that, like, it's a very crude instrument, something like the Beck Depression Inventory, for instance. When we're trying to measure somebody's level of depression, we're asking them questions about themselves, which is a very good way to get very not great data. But when you do that a couple of 100,000 times, you start to recognize that the Beck Depression Inventory is actually like very reliable. And so we, you know, kind of take that to mean valid in some very complex ways. But yes, we have good research on these things, and it's worth maybe poking around some of that research just to know that it exists.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Real quick before I get out of your hair, Ink-blots, how true are they? Come on, really.
Thank you for asking. And I'm going to let you go while they answer. So thank you so much for calling. But yeah, Emily and Christy, Ink-blots.
I mean, I find it kind of a fun thing to kick around. I mean, projective tests like that have never been super accurate, and that is okay because nobody really uses them anymore, but never was really in wide scale usage anyway. So often folks will see a serial killer being interviewed on a movie or something, and they'll bust out something like that. And it's important to remember that the particular tools to measure the particular things that we're looking for in some of those situations, a lot of these tests were developed and designed for very specific populations who are struggling with like homicidal rage, or, you know, people who had committed like mass murder. We developed a lot of tests around folks like that, for people like that. So for people like that, they had some amount of verifiability, some amount of validity and reliability, but the Ink-blot is not really a thing anymore. There's like a handful of folks that are still trained and that still utilize it, but no, it's donezo. We've got better science now. Does that all feel accurate to you, Emily?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was only covered briefly in one of my classes, right, as sort of a historical piece. I think what's interesting about it is that it was developed around this idea of a norm. So the Ink-blot really is like people who fit this idea of norm that psychology had at the time tend to see specific things in it. And then the test was sort of like, well, do you see kind of what everyone else sees, or are you noticing something different? So I think it's interesting to think about, like, why was there this idea of norm? How narrow is that idea of normal and abnormal? And do we want to still hold to that idea, or do we have a more curious and creative idea of, the colorful kaleidoscope of human expression and human experience?
Mhm.
So, I think that test is valid, again, in a certain context with people who are very trained in it, but that's not going to be the majority of people who are practicing therapy or even psychology.
Yeah. Well, we mentioned, or I kind of casually threw out there Wikipedia and Google Scholar, and I recognize that these are not tools for like sophisticated data science or like deep research. But I also know that the folks listening tonight are not data scientists; they're not research scientists. So I wanted to ask if you had any particular resources or recommendations or just strategies that people can utilize if they do want to maybe scratch the surface a little bit on something their therapist said, or on some sort of like particular therapeutic modality or practice or exercise or whatever the hell.
Yeah, I mean, YouTube and even TikTok, right? So much of there's a lot of good information out there, right? But there's a lot of bad information out there. So I think use discernment, or maybe check things with primary sources. But I appreciate a culture that's more willing to talk about psychological practices, therapeutic terms and modalities. I think more of this should be discussed and talked about, and certainly validated or checked for accuracy. But I appreciate that more people are talking about mental health, right? And the ways that it can be impacted. I also want to shout out one of my favorite podcasts. It's actually called Very Bad Therapy. And it's two therapists who interview a client about their bad therapy and then discuss, sometimes with another therapist, why it was bad therapy and how it could have been good therapy. And I think that's a great way, right? It's kind of fun and gossipy, right? To hear about someone else's experience. But also I appreciate that they talk about how could this be good therapy, or what should good therapy look like when discussing certain aspects. So I think more information is always entertaining, but useful.
Yeah. Well, fair enough. With that thought in mind, are there any final words that you want to make sure to leave the audience with tonight? Any last impressions that you want to put on everybody's mind as we walk out the door?
Yeah, I guess I don't know if this is an appropriate time to just talk about some of the resources for finding a therapist, right? These are kind of specific to the United States. So if you're in another place, things might look very different for you. But a few organizations and websites that are reliable. The first is seculartherapy.org, right? So that's for people who have declared that they are not going to use religion in their treatment and that their work is grounded in something else. And I think that's a great place to start for this community. The second is inclusivetherapist.com. So I love that there's more and more queer, trans, people of color leading in this field. And if you're looking for someone who's a therapist who maybe shares an experience you have, or shares an expertise that you're interested in learning more about, there's great people who are posting on the Inclusive Therapist directory. Another one is reclamationcollective.com, which is specifically for religious trauma. And they have support groups and a therapist directory with people who are specializing and working together to support people with harmful religious experiences or religious transitions. And the last is about affordable therapy. Again, I know we mentioned insurance coverage and how that can be a challenge in therapy. But there's a place that's called openpathcollective.org. And that's a place where therapists offer lower cost sessions to people. And you can sort, in a variety of ways, find someone in your area or who's licensed in your place that you're interested in receiving therapy in some of the specialties that you have.
Yeah. Well, and I'll go ahead and remind the audience that you can find links to all of those things in the show notes to this episode. And then finally, Emily, you had mentioned to me that you were working on a purity culture recovery group. And I just wanted to give you a quick opportunity to walk people through what that actually means, what that could look like.
Absolutely. So I know we talked a little bit about groups earlier and some of the challenges with them, but I'm actually working on bringing together a group of people right now who are specifically interested in working through purity culture recovery and the relational and emotional impacts of that, where, even if you've left religion behind, the impacts of purity culture can still sit with you and still affect you in ways that you feel like are limiting. So unfortunately, it's only for people who are located in California. But if that's you and you come across this podcast or this show or in the Discord or any of the other resources, reach out. I'll have some information posted, and our group starts February 1st. And it's going to be virtual. So if you're in California and you're interested in working on purity culture recovery with a therapist and in a community setting where you get to have that peer support, as well as some psychoeducation, there's a link that hopefully you can find and potentially join our group or share it with somebody who needs it.
Fantastic. And it looks like there's some really good, there was really good references up there for where people can find you. But is there anywhere else that you want to direct people for where they can find you?
I'm on Instagram, and my Instagram is on there. And I try to post, obviously, free content that would support people who are thinking about religious recovery and trying to live lives, outside of the harmful aspects that religion can bring.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us. It has been a really, really good conversation. And I think we got into some really meaty topics. We all get on here and we play and we have fun and we chit chat and we talk, but we couldn't do any of this without the background crew. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank everybody working in the background and maybe call up that crew cam. There they are tonight. Thank you guys all for what you do, because without you guys, there's no us. So thank you guys for your hard work. I also wanted to kind of bring to people's attention some of the different ways that you can either find us at the ACA and our content, or find more ways to get in contact with us and get merch and stuff like that. So first, we have tiny.cc/AEN podcasts. This is a great place to go to find every single show that the ACA does. If you want to go back and watch old episodes, if you've missed a newer episode, this is a great place to find all of it in one place. We also, on Facebook, if you want to follow us and continue the conversation, maybe do some posts or engage in some of the post questions that get posted there, you can check out our Facebook Secular Sexuality fan group. It's very active in conversation, and some of the prompt questions are really fun to get the conversation flowing. So check us out there. If you want to talk more live, like in a group chat or anything like that, check us out on tiny.cc/ACD Discord. That's Atheist Community of Discord, where we will be, I think, after the show, if I'm not mistaken, for the after show. So tiny.cc/ACD Discord. If you want to check out any of our fun merchandise or sport a coffee cup or a t-shirt to show off your secular sexuality affinity, check it out at tiny.cc/merchaca. So you can see there on the screen where to find it. And that's about it for today. Thank you guys all. We had a great show, and thank you guys for joining us, and we will catch you all next time.
Yeah, thank you too so much for being here. Thank you to everybody who has watched tonight. I would like to encourage you to find a great therapist, to work to trust that therapist, but trust but verify. Be on the lookout for good pseudoscience, and perhaps more important than anything that we've discussed tonight, I think this is a great moment to show yourself a little bit of kindness, to show yourself a little bit of care, and perhaps to even give yourself a big ol' orgasm. Or better yet, give someone else one.
Watch The Atheist Experience live Sundays at 4:30 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTAXP and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callaxp.